Hello and welcome to Media 7. I'm Russell Brown. Rupert Murdoch's News Limited empire will often wind up on the wrong side of global media critiques, but in Fiji it suddenly looks like the victim. That's thanks to the Fijian regime's draft Media Industry Development Decree, which is regarded as troubling by even some supporters of the country's unelected leadership. Among other things, proposed rules on media ownership would force news to unload its holding in the Fiji Times newspaper, a persistent critic of Commodore Frank Bainimarama and his interim government. But is Fiji the only Pacific state where press freedom is under threat? And what's at stake in the region? Jose Barbosa has the background.
While the wars of yesteryear got the full Hollywood makeover and gratuitous promotion in the news hour, a month-long standoff between anti-government protesters and security forces came to a head in Bangkok. The violence on our doorstep has been getting token coverage here, a second banana to reports on wedding expos and on-air crustacean executions.
He's absolutely gone now.
But in the Pacific, it's governments themselves, not just blasé news editors, who are a threat to unfettered reporting. Fiji's draft media decree would stop the publication of any material that appears to be even vaguely critical of the regime.
The emphasis here should be, what is good for Fiji? Are we going to have media organisations that have a sense of loyalty to Fiji?
With heavy fines handed out to journalists who try to do so.
You know just as well as I do how much journalists get paid, and I'm sure you don't want to be sitting at the end of a fine that will take you 10 years of your lifetime to pay.
It also says only 10% of any media outlet can be foreign-based, a clear swipe at the Fiji Times, owned by Rupert Murdoch's News Limited. Condemnation has been swift from all quarters, which includes the Samoan Prime Minister, Tuilae Pasarelli, who criticised the Fiji regime for trying to silence its critics. Which is deliciously ironic because the Samoan government brought a complaint to the BSA about a story broadcast by One News and Tagata Pacifica last year. Barbara Drever's story examined the country's illegal arms trade.
If South Auckland had access to the guns that you can get here in Samoa, South Auckland would be a war zone, a different place.
The Samoan government claimed it created a false impression of Samoan culture. The complaint was upheld by the BSA, which pleased the Samoan officials so much they promptly breached the embargo around the decision. Meanwhile, it's been getting worse for the establishment in Tonga. The Princess Ashika ferry took 74 lives with it when it sank last year. A Royal Commission report on the tragedy placed the blame on the shipping company and government officials who purchased the clearly unseaworthy vessel.
The Prime Minister, Dr. Feleti Savelli, was also singled out for hiding information from the Commission. It said emails relevant to the inquiry should have been included in his affidavit.
It's possible more scrutiny from the media could have saved those people on the Princess Ashika. If journalists are being blocked and threatened by so-called democratic governments, how many disasters are waiting to happen? So how do news organisations in the Pacific respond? And should our government, with millions spent annually on aid in the region, start demanding more in the way of press freedom?
With me now are the Director of the Pacific Media Centre at AUT, David Roby, TVNZ Pacific Correspondent Barbara Drever, and the Chair of the Commonwealth Press Union's Media Freedom Committee, Tim Pankhurst. Welcome to you all. David, let's start with the draft media decree. I don't think anyone is saying it's a good thing. How bad a thing is it in your view?
Well, I think it's utterly draconian and repressive. It is no surprise. This is something we've been building up to for quite some time. We've had a year of censorship in Fiji newsrooms ever since the abrogation of the Constitution in April last year. And this time it's been used by the regime to trot out this decree. In fact, a decree of this form is something that's been in the wings for a very long time, not only in Fiji and many other countries in the region. I remember living in Papua New Guinea, for example, in the mid-90s, where the Minister of Communication at that time, Gabriel Ramoy, had trotted out a decree known as the Media Tribunal Bill, with similar sorts of draconian punishments meted out to journalists. Fortunately, the media jumped up in arms, and the PNG Media Council was very strong at that time, and there was such a huge fuss that the politicians backed away very quickly. But the decree is actually actually been in various forms in Fiji, even under the democratic governments, and so the regime's just been waiting for the opportunity to trot this out.
And it certainly wasn't able to be fended off in the situation in Fiji as it was in Papua New Guinea.
That's right, and it's really been dependent on international reaction, which has been very, very strong. Surprisingly, the regime has actually acted with a little bit of surprise, that, well, as if they didn't expect this sort of response internationally when it was so predictable.
Well, they did their 4 days consultation on it, didn't they? And they actually even invited the affected parties in.
Well, the consultation was a farce right from the beginning. First of all, the two of the major affected media organisations, the Fiji Times, as we've just seen in the clip, both of them were excluded in the early stages of leading up to the consultation. Eventually, in the 11th hour, they were given a place at the table, so to speak, but they only had just over 2.5 hours for media organisations to actually go through the draft and then make their representations on the spot.
We noted the proposed ownership rule, which would mean that the Fiji Times would have to find someone else to buy itself within 3 months. What are the other worrying features to you?
Well, first of all, the lack of transparency and accountability. You have a minister appointing the director of MEDA, which is the Media Industry Development Authority, Singaporean style, which is supposedly going to sort of lead media development in the country. What this really is an agency enabling for the regime to control the media. This agency would be headed by a director appointed by a minister, no other consultation, no representation from the public generally, let alone the media industry. Then there's also a media tribunal, which would be empowered to punitively act against media organisations that breach the terms of the decree.
So generally a nightmare to be a journalist.
A nightmare for journalists, essentially.
And Barbara, we've seen more of the same thing this week in Fiji TV. 2 journalists have essentially been marched out of the newsroom and put somewhere else in the organisation.
Yes, that's right, and it's been announced this week, but it actually happened some time ago. One way that the military's been trying to control Fiji TV is, because they couldn't, is they started infiltrating the board. And so Lieutenant Colonel Leweni, who was once a bandmaster and has now risen to dizzying heights within the military, got himself into the shareholders, appointed to the shareholders board, the Yasana and group, and then he got elected to the Fiji TV board, and he made arrangements for Marana Kitioni, who's the head of news and current affairs, and Anish Chand, who's the head of news, both excellent journalists. They have so much experience. I've known Marana for 17 years, and Anish for many, many years as well. They're good people, and they just didn't play ball. They refused to call Bainimarama the Prime Minister. They'd say interim Prime Minister, which would drive him into a rage. And so these little ways that they could get sort of try and stand up to an illegal regime. And that's why they were removed. Now, I see Fiji TV's come out this morning and said that they weren't removed because they were biased. And that's quite true. They weren't removed because they were biased. They were removed because they're good journalists. And Fiji TV, I guess, had little choice in the matter. In fact, I've been told by insiders that the choice was get rid of Marana and Anish, or the whole newsroom goes, and that would be 80 people.
And I presume that this was also possible because Lieutenant Colonel Leweni is on the board.
Absolutely.
Do you think that's what they've got an eye on with the ownership rules with the newspapers, that they can be running those boards as well?
Well, they're running a whole lot of boards. I mean, several military guys are running the Suva Rugby Union. And the chairman of that is Bainimarama's brother-in-law, who has just come out of jail for manslaughter, and he's head of the Navy. Okay, so he is the chairman of the Suva Rugby Board, and Taleni, who's the head of the police, is also on that board. They're all on
I
boards.
presume there's money in these jobs on boards too.
Look, it's they're making money from it, and yeah.
Tim, I'm going to take a wild guess and suggest that the Commonwealth Press Union is concerned about developments in Fiji.
Look, it certainly is. I've got the decree here, all 49 pages of it, and it's a cynical document and it's a sinister one. And when you look at the Orwellian title, Media Industry Development Decree, I mean, that immediately rings alarm bells. And the crux of it here is where it talks about the functions of the authority. And it's to encourage, promote and facilitate the development of media organisations and services in Fiji, which serve the national interest. And, you know, that's the way the Chinese Communist Party operates. And who decides what is the national interest? The military does.
It's interesting that I've seen Crosby Walsh, who's one of the defenders of the regime, say that maybe the Western model of adversarial speaking truth to power journalism doesn't apply in developing countries, and you have to have a developmental model of journalism. Does that make any sense to you? No,
it doesn't. I don't accept that. I believe that, yes, you do need to be sensitive to cultural mores, but at the moment in China there are 158 miners stuck underground. The poor sods have been there for getting on for 2 weeks. The Chinese media has decreed that there is to be no coverage of this because it could bring attention to bear on dangerous practices that the authorities are complicit in. That is closing down information that affects those people's lives. It's not much of a parallel to draw with what's happening in the Pacific.
David, can I just make a point about development journalism? Because this is a term that the regime has used, and not only in Fiji, it's politicians have used this term throughout the region. But there are various definitions of what development journalism is. I would see development journalism as very, very akin to investigative journalism in Western media. But the problem is that the decree has adopted a Singaporean model, and there are many other models of development journalism, and it's really all about process, investigating the process, and so therefore you get into investigating and revealing corruption and failures in the bureaucratic systems and that sort of thing. But the politicians in the Pacific have latched on to what they think is development journalism, which is sort of the term, for example, journalism of hope. Or just good news.
Barbara, obviously Fiji looks like the toughest place to report at the moment. What's the rest of the Pacific like for you?
It's varied. For me, I just go in and do my job. It's fine for me, and I leave. And having worked and lived in the Pacific for 20 years, I'm quite comfortable there. But for the journalists who live and work there, Tonga and Samoa have their own form of censorship. I mean, a lot of them have a government-owned or owned by a politician, and they're not allowed to report on anything to do with government or anti-government. Sometimes my pieces are not played. Our news goes to those countries and it's cut out. For Samoa and Tonga in particular, it's pretty grim.
Well, we'll take a break now and talk about the fortunes of the media in those two countries after the break.